All right, this will be a really short video because this lesson group was the one that you guys had when you did your or when you got your project. So the first half of it, lesson 16, is technically trust is 3, but that was just the activity um that we did as a class, and I included all the information from that in the previous video. So this one's really just on frames, and we kind of barely touched on it. The first part of frames is just kind of the approach to solving the problems, and then the next slide is just a little bit more about some tips that you're going to need and like rules from the past that you'll have to bring back for this section. But so a frame is still a structure that supports forces, but it's different from a truss because with trusses, the ends of members are connected with pins, right? So um, at every the only places where joints connect are at pins, and they only like all of the ends meet at each other, if that makes sense. So if you remember the practice problem we did in class where it was like that frame structure where there was the two force member connecting two members of what looked like an upside down L, that wouldn't be a truss because the diagonal member was not joined at the pins at the end of the bottom of the vertical member and the right side of the horizontal member. So because they weren't joined all at the pins, that's not a truss. So that's a good way of identifying that. So once you identify that it's a frame, it's essentially going to be a matter of pulling apart the whole body, right? So similar to trusses in that you have to break it up into a smaller like group of problems, but you do it differently for frames, right? So instead of cutting anything, you're not going to cut anything when you're dealing with a frame. You either assign it as a two force member and then label it and ignore it. You label it as a force and then ignore the member itself, or you simply pull the pins out and separate the individual bodies, right? So like in that problem that I was just talking about, the diagonal member was a two force member because there were no other forces acting on that body at all. And um, we assigned that FBD and then pretended it didn't exist anymore. And then in terms of solving the rest of the problem, we just separated the pin at the top of the vertical and left of the horizontal members and then broke it up into two separate members instead of one joined frame. So by doing that, you create two free body diagrams, one of which will have 3 or fewer unknowns, right? Because now it's a non-concurrent force system, so you have 3 equations, but as a larger body, you'll have more than one of the equation, or more than 3 unknowns. So by separating it, you can solve one piece, transfer the knowns that you calculated, which in the problem that I was just talking about was FBD, and then the reactions at the pins, you can transfer those to the reactions or to the other free body diagram and then solve for the other reactions there. So it's very similar to trusses in that you solve, it's kind of like method of sections where you kind of solve the part that you care about, and you kind of only can do that in terms of the um, the number of unknowns in the free body diagram. But other than that, the only difference is that you're not cutting anything, you're just separating bodies. And then again, it becomes just a series of equilibrium problems. So like I said, this slide is about things to remember, and I just kind of kept a running list as we were going through that problem, right? So the first thing is that if you calculate a negative value for a magnitude, that means whatever direction you assumed is the opposite direction of the actual force, right? So in your answer, like what physically goes in the box at the bottom of the page for a quiz or exam, your answer should always be positive. So that would mean that you have to flip the direction. But once you draw a free body diagram, you don't change it. So if any calculations moving forward in the problem use that value, you use the negative number so you don't change your free body diagram. So using the negative number will ultimately flip the value to what it should be, but by changing the direction, you would be risking error, right? Because you've made assumptions based on that assigned direction. So don't change the direction in the calculation, change it in the answer, and that's it. The next thing that I wanted to talk about is two force members, right? So that BD component in the problem I was talking about before. And the nice thing about two force members is that they only have one unknown, and that's the magnitude, right? Because the direction of the force is going in the direction of the member, and you know that from labeled geometry on the problem. So that's one way that you can eliminate an unknown, because there won't be an X and a Y component. They'll just really be the direction going, or the force going along the member itself. So, and then when you're solving a problem, regardless of whether it's necessarily a frames problem or a truss problem where you need to use this, when you're taking a magnitude, or when you're taking a moment, right? If you have three unknowns, the first thing you have to do is take a moment. And by taking a moment, you'll eliminate two of the unknowns, hopefully, and then solve for one. That being said, the way that you do that is by taking the moment about a common point of several unknowns, right? So in the problem we did for, it was like secret envelope 2, I think, where you had to find the equation, right? It was the sum of the moments about D, because two of the unknowns line of actions went through point D, so that their perpendicular distance would essentially be 0. So by doing that, we were able to automatically find OK, which is the one we were looking for. So that kind of same process applies to frames, in that if you have your unknowns at your pin reactions, if you take the moment about the location of the pin, it'll clear those reactions so that you can solve for any other force on that free body diagram, right? And then once you solve that, you'll be able to just do some of the forces in the X direction, some of the forces in the Y direction. So the last thing, let's see, values of a forces. Okay, so that's another thing. When you're separating these bodies, right, into, if you're separating a frame into two, three, however many individual components, right, by pulling the pins, the pin reactions will be equal and opposite, right? So equal in magnitude, but if I'm assuming that it's pushing on one body, it also has to be pushing on the other body. So ultimately the arrow, so on your free body diagrams, essentially the arrows will be pointing in opposite directions, is the easiest way to explain it. That being said, the same thing goes for two force members, right? So if I assume that the member is, or the force is pushing away from, or pulling away from the free body diagram for one member, it also has to be pulling away from the free body diagram of another member. So that was the last thing I had in terms of content. Here are my office hours again. I'm going to keep bringing it up until people start showing up more regularly. I have my group of probably 15 of you who come a lot, and I really appreciate that because you guys are the best. But I'd love to see more people. So, and based on the exam scores, I probably should see more people. No shade, just facts. So here's that. So here's my office hours, and if you have any questions outside of these office hours or can't make them, email me. We can either set something up, or I can try to answer your questions via email. But other than that, have a great weekend. At this point, I'm pretty much all caught up in terms of the lessons that haven't been posted yet, so that's nice. Yeah, so have a great weekend, and I'll see you guys on Monday or Wednesday.